Sometimes the deepest love comes without words, carried only in the quiet songs we hum when we think no one's listening. For 3 years now, widowed Eli Boone has started each Montana morning the same way, sweeping his cabin floor while humming old tunes his mama taught him. His faithful hound Sawyer lies by the fireplace, grey muzzle peaceful on his paws. It's a simple routine that keeps them both going since Martha passed. But Eli doesn't know something important. His old dog only sleeps deeply when Eli sings. On silent days, Sawyer paces restlessly, sensing trouble his master can't see. So when one October morning Eli wakes with his throat tight and no song in his heart, the dog's worried howling might be trying to tell him something. What does Sawyer know that Eli doesn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered prayer against the Montana sky, its pine logs darkened by decades of mountain storms and summer sun. Eli Boone had built it with his own hands 32 years ago, back when his hair was black as creekstone and his dreams were bigger than the valley that cradled them. Now pushing 60 with silver, threading through what remained of that dark hair, he moved through the familiar rooms with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that hurrying only shortened the day. The hand-carved pine broom in his weathered hands had been his father's before him, crafted from a single piece of sugar pine during the winter of 1943. Old Heinrich Boone had whittled it smooth during the long evenings when the snow piled higher than the cabin windows, teaching his young son that a man's tools were extensions of his character. "Take care of them, and they'll take care of you," Heinrich had said, his German accent still thick after 30 years in America. The broom's handle bore the gentle polish of countless mornings, worn smooth by 3 generations of Boone hands. Each morning brought the same ritual. Eli would rise with the first grey light filtering through the east window, kindle the fire in the stone hearth he'd laid stone by stone, and set the coffee to brewing in the dented aluminum pot that had been Martha's grandmother's. While the cabin warmed and the coffee percolated, he would take up his father's broom and begin the day's first song. It was never the same tune twice. Sometimes it would be Shenandoah, the melody drifting low and mournful as he swept the dust from beneath the kitchen table. Other mornings brought Danny Boy or The Water is Wide, songs his mother had hummed while kneading bread in their old kitchen in Missoula. On days when his heart felt lighter, he might find himself humming "Oh, Susanna," or one of the old logging songs his grandfather had brought down from the timber camps. The music seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than memory, flowing out of him as natural as breathing. His voice, though roughened by years of mountain wind and the occasional cigar, still carried the clear baritone that had caught Martha's ear at the county dance 41 years ago. She used to tease him that he sang prettier than most women, though she said it with the kind of smile that made a man stand taller. Sawyer had joined their household 7 years back, a gift from Martha when the loneliness of the mountain winters had begun to weigh heavier on Eli's shoulders. The blue-tick hound puppy had been all ears and paws then, tumbling through the cabin like a small tornado. Martha had chosen him from a litter in town, claiming she could tell by the way the pup's ears perked up at the sound of Eli's voice that they were meant for each other. "He's got music in him," she had declared, watching the young dog's tail wag in perfect time to Eli's humming. Just like his daddy. Now, at 7 years old, Sawyer had grown into his ears and settled into the rhythms of mountain life. His coat bore the silver of middle age, particularly around his muzzle and the wise brown eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog had a right to. Each morning, as Eli began his sweeping and singing, Sawyer would pad to his favorite spot by the stone fireplace, circle 3 times in the ancient ritual of his kind, and settle onto the braided rug Martha had made from old wool sweaters. The dog's breathing would slow and deepen as Eli's voice filled the cabin, his body relaxing completely in a way that spoke of absolute trust and contentment. It was a peaceful sight that had become as much. a part of Eli's morning. Routine as the coffee and the broom. The faithful, hound at rest, while his master tended to. Their shared home, the cabin itself, told the story of a life lived deliberately. The kitchen held Martha's cast-iron skillet, still seasoned black, and hanging on its hook beside the stove. Her apron remained draped over the back of the chair where she used to sit and shell peas while Eli worked in the garden. The front room bore witness to their evenings together, his reading chair angled toward the fireplace, hers positioned to catch the last light from the west window for her needlework. The bedroom they had shared for 29 years now felt too large, the double bed too wide for one man's sleep. Eli had taken to sleeping on Martha's side, telling himself it was because the mattress was less worn there, though the truth ran deeper than comfort. On her pillow, he could still catch the faintest trace of the lavender sachets she had made each spring from the flowers that grew wild in the meadow behind the cabin. The walls held photographs, spanning their life together, their wedding day, the celebration when he'd finished building the cabin, Martha's 50th birthday party, with half the valley in attendance. In each picture, Martha's smile seemed to light the room, her joy infectious even in faded black and white. There were no children in those photographs, a sorrow they had carried quietly together. The mountain had given them each other and asked for their acceptance that it would have to be enough. Beyond the cabin's walls, the world stretched in all directions with a vastness that humbled and comforted in equal measure. To the east, the crazy mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks touching the sky with snow that never fully melted. Westward, the valley opened toward the distant Bridger Range, where eagles rode the thermals and the wind carried the scent of sage and pine across miles of untouched wilderness. The nearest neighbor, Sarah McKinnon, lived 3 miles down the mountain road in a smaller cabin she had inherited from her aunt. A retired schoolteacher from Bozeman, she had moved to the valley 5 years back, seeking the same solitude that had drawn Eli and Martha decades earlier. Sarah made the drive up to check on Eli every few weeks, bringing supplies from town and news from the outside world that felt increasingly foreign to mountain rhythms. "You're living too much in your head. Eli Boone," she would tell him, settling into Martha's chair with a cup of coffee, while Sawyer begged shamelessly for the cookies she always brought. Martha wouldn't want you turning into a hermit on her account, but Eli found comfort in the routines that had served him well through 3 years of widowerhood. The morning sweep and song, the afternoon chores, the evening hours reading by firelight while Sawyer dozed at his feet. Simple rhythms that asked little and gave much, anchoring him to a life that still held meaning even in its diminished state. The seasons marked time on the mountain with a clarity that city dwellers never knew. Spring arrived with the return of the meadowlarks and the first brave wildflowers pushing through the melting snow. Summer brought long days of garden work and the satisfaction of split firewood stacked high against the coming cold. Autumn painted the aspen groves in gold and crimson, while winter wrapped the valley in a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Through each season, the morning ritual remained constant. Eli would rise, kindle the fire, start the coffee, and take up his father's broom. As the first notes of whatever song chose him that day began to flow, Sawyer would settle into his place by the hearth, breathing deep and easy in the warmth of home and music. It was, Eli often reflected, a good life for a man past his prime and a dog growing grey around the muzzle. Not the life he had planned in his younger years, perhaps, but one that fit the shape of who he had become. The mountain had taught him patience, solitude had taught him self-reliance, and Martha's love had taught him that some gifts were too precious to measure. As October settled over the valley with its promise of winter's approach, Eli could not have imagined how fragile the balance of his peaceful routine truly was. He swept his floors and sang his songs, unaware that the faithful hound sleeping by the fire depended on that music for more than comfort. In the way of men who have lived long and quietly, Eli had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his days, without questioning the deeper currents that sustained them. The mountain morning light filtered through windows that had witnessed decades of such mornings, falling across a man and his dog locked in a dance of devotion neither fully understood. The broom whispered against the pine floors. Eli's voice rose in gentle melody, and Sawyer slept the deep sleep of the truly content. It was enough, Eli thought as he finished his sweeping and hung the broom in its appointed place. For now it was enough. The letter had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, tucked between the pages of Martha's well-worn copy of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Eli discovered it on a Tuesday morning in mid-October while dusting the bookshelf, a chore he had been avoiding since Martha's passing. The leather-bound volume had been one of her favorites, its margins filled with her careful handwriting and observations about the natural world that surrounded their mountain home. As he lifted the book to wipe beneath it, several folded sheets of Martha's cream-colored stationery fluttered to the floor, like autumn leaves. Her handwriting covered both sides of each page in the careful script she had learned in the one-room schoolhouse of her childhood. The date at the top made Eli's breath catch. March 15th, just 2 weeks before the cancer had taken her voice completely. "My dearest Eli," the letter began, and he had to sit heavily in her reading chair before his legs gave way beneath him. "If you're reading this, then you've finally gotten around to dusting my books, which means I've been gone long enough for you to run out of other chores to avoid. I know you, my love, and I know how you retreat into work when your heart is heavy. I hope by now you've learned that avoiding a thing doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it grow larger in the shadows. I want to tell you about your singing while I still have the words to do it. You probably think your morning songs are just habit, something you do without thinking, like brushing your teeth or checking the weather. But I need you to know that your voice has been the soundtrack of our life together, the thing that turned this cabin from a house into a home. Do you remember the first time I heard you sing? It was at the county dance, and you were too shy to ask me to waltz, so you hummed the melody instead while we stood by the punch bowl. The Tennessee Waltz, it was, and your voice was so pure and true that I fell in love with you right then and there. Before I even knew your name, every morning for 29 years, I woke to the sound of you singing while you swept the floor. It was better than any alarm clock, gentler than any sunrise. On the days when my bones ached or my heart felt heavy, your voice would wrap around me like a warm quilt, reminding me that no matter what troubles the world might hold, here in this place, with you, everything was exactly as it should be. I know you think the songs are for you, something to pass the time while you work. But they were always for me, Eli. Every note, every melody, they were love letters written in music, and I treasured every one. Even Sawyer knows it. Watch him sometime when you sing. See how he settles into that deep, peaceful sleep. That dog knows what I know, that your voice is a gift that brings comfort to every living thing lucky enough to hear it. I'm writing this because I'm afraid of what will happen to your music when I'm gone. You'll think it died with me, that there's no point in singing to an empty house. But that's not true, my love. The music isn't about who's listening, it's about who's singing. It's the part of you that stays connected to joy, to hope, to the belief that life is still worth celebrating, even when it breaks our hearts. Promise me you won't let the silence win. Promise me you'll keep singing even when, especially when, it hurts. Your voice is medicine, Eli. It heals things that need healing, comforts things that need comfort. Don't let that gift go to waste because you think no one's listening. Someone is always listening, even if you can't see them. Sawyer will need your songs. He's more sensitive than you know, more connected to the rhythms of your heart. And someday, when you're ready, there might be others who need that comfort too. The valley has gotten lonelier since we first came here. People are hungry for the kind of peace your music brings. I love you more than words can say, more than songs can sing. But if words fail and songs are all we have left, then sing, my darling. Sing for me, sing for Sawyer, sing for the mountains and the sky, and anyone who needs to remember that beauty still exists in this world. Take care of each other. Take care of the music. All my love, always and forever, Martha. Eli's hands trembled, as he read the final lines, the paper blurring through tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months. 3 years of careful emotional control crumbled in the space of a few minutes, leaving him raw and exposed in ways he had forgotten were possible. The letter slipped from his fingers as grief crashed over him in waves. Not the manageable daily ache he had learned to carry, but the crushing weight of fresh loss multiplied by years of suppressed sorrow. He wept for the conversations they would never have, for the mornings when he had sung without knowing she was listening, for the terrible silence that had settled over their cabin like dust over abandoned dreams. He wept for Sawyer, sleeping peacefully by the fire, unaware that his master's world had just shifted on its axis. Most of all, he wept for the songs that had died in his throat the day Martha drew her last breath, for the music that had been buried with her when he thought his voice no longer mattered. When the tears finally subsided, Eli sat in the gathering dusk, Martha's letter scattered at his feet like the pieces of a life he was no longer sure how to reassemble. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending the first dead leaves of autumn scratching against the glass. The sound seemed to echo the emptiness inside his chest, a hollow scraping that spoke of things coming to an end. For the first time in 3 years, Eli went to bed without humming a single note. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with frost silvering the meadow grass and ice filming the water bucket on the back porch. Eli moved through his routine like a man walking underwater, kindling the fire, starting the coffee, taking up his father's broom. But when he opened his mouth to begin the day's first song, nothing emerged but silence. His throat felt closed, not from illness but from something deeper, as if the very mechanism of joy had seized up during the night. He tried to force out a note, any note, but the effort left him feeling foolish and more alone than ever. The broom moved across the floor in eerie quiet, its whisper against the pine boards the only sound in the cabin. From his place by the fireplace, Sawyer lifted his head and watched his master with growing confusion. The dog's ears pricked forward, waiting for the familiar melody that always accompanied the morning sweep. When none came, Sawyer rose to his feet and padded across the room, pressing his grey muzzle against Eli's leg in a gesture of concern that nearly broke the old man's heart. "I'm sorry." "Boy," Eli whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse. "I just can't today." But Sawyer didn't return to his comfortable spot by the fire. Instead, he began to pace, first to the door, then back to Eli, then to the window, his nails clicking against the floorboards in an anxious rhythm that filled the silence with its own kind of music. The dog's breathing quickened, and his tail remained low, tucked close to his body in a posture Eli had rarely seen from his usually confident companion. By midday, Sawyer's restlessness had escalated to whining, a high, worried sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. He would not settle, would not eat, would not even accept the strips of jerky that usually sent him into ecstasies of gratitude. Instead, he followed Eli from room to room, his brown eyes filled with an anxiety that seemed to mirror his master's internal turmoil. That evening, as Eli sat reading by the fire or pretending to read while his mind churned through Martha's words, Sawyer began to howl. It started low and mournful, rising gradually to a sound so full of anguish that it seemed to shake the cabin walls. The howl spoke of loss and confusion, of a world suddenly turned upside down by the absence of something essential. Eli closed his book and stared at his faithful companion, understanding for the first time that his silence was causing suffering beyond his own. Martha had been right. Someone was always listening, even when he couldn't see them. The music mattered more than he had known, served purposes deeper than simple habit or personal comfort. But knowing and doing were different countries, separated by a chasm of grief that felt too wide to bridge. As Sawyer's howls echoed through the mountain night, Eli wondered if some silences, once embraced, could ever be broken again. 3 days passed, in a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Eli moved through his routines like a man walking through deep snow, each step requiring conscious effort, each movement slower than the last. The morning sweep continued without song. The afternoon chores proceeded in muted concentration, and the evenings stretched long and hollow beside a fire that seemed to give less warmth than before. Sawyer's distress had evolved from pacing to something more concerning. The old hound had developed a tremor in his hindquarters, a fine shaking that became more pronounced when he tried to rest. His appetite had disappeared entirely, and the bright alertness that had always characterized his personality had dimmed to a worried, watchful anxiety that followed Eli like a shadow. On the fourth morning, desperate to ease his companion's suffering, Eli tried everything he could think of. He offered Sawyer strips of bacon from his own breakfast plate, usually an irresistible treat that would have the dog dancing with anticipation. Sawyer sniffed the offering politely but turned away, his tail low and ears drooping with an exhaustion that sleep could not cure. "Come on, you boy," Eli coaxed, kneeling beside the dog's favorite spot by the fireplace. "You've got to eat something." But food held no appeal for a creature whose distress ran deeper than hunger. Eli tried taking him for longer walks, hoping the familiar mountain trails might restore some measure of peace to his agitated companion. They wandered the deer paths that crisscrossed the meadow behind the cabin, climbed the ridge where Martha used to gather wildflowers for her pressed flower collections, and followed the creek down to the beaver pond where they had spent countless peaceful afternoons. The exercise seemed to help momentarily. Sawyer's step would quicken on the trail, his nose would lift to catch interesting scents, and for brief moments he would appear almost normal. But as soon as they returned to the cabin, the anxiety would settle over him again, like a heavy blanket. He would position himself where he could watch Eli constantly, his brown eyes holding a question that his master couldn't understand, much less answer. It was during one of these restless afternoons, as Eli searched through the cabin for anything that might provide comfort to his suffering companion, that he found himself standing before Martha's old music box. The carved wooden chest sat on the dresser in their bedroom, its lid decorated with painted roses that had faded to soft pastels over the decades. He had not opened it since her passing, unable to face the collection of small treasures she had accumulated over their years together. With hands that trembled slightly, Eli lifted the lid. The familiar melody of Für Elise began to play immediately, the delicate notes plinking out from the tiny mechanism with a sweetness that made his chest tighten. Nestled among Martha's jewelry and keepsakes, wrapped in a piece of faded blue silk, lay something he had not seen in 15 years, his old harmonica. The Honor Marine Band had been a gift from his grandfather when Eli turned 12, back when the world was full of possibility and music seemed as natural as breathing. Made of wood and brass, it bore the gentle wear of countless hours of practice and play. He could remember sitting on the front porch of his childhood home, learning to coax melodies from the reeds, while his grandfather nodded approval and his mother smiled. From the kitchen window, the harmonica felt strange in his hands. After so many years, smaller than memory had made it, but familiar in the way that old friends remain familiar even after long separation. He turned it over, examining the worn lettering and the places where his young fingers had polished the metal smooth. Why Martha had kept it, he couldn't say. Perhaps she had known that someday he would need to remember the boy who had once believed that music could heal anything. That evening, as Sawyer lay beside the fireplace in his restless half-sleep, Eli sat in his reading chair and held the harmonica up to the lamplight. The instrument seemed to hold the weight of decades, all the songs he had played, all the music he had abandoned when the responsibilities of adulthood demanded more practical pursuits. He remembered how Martha had loved to hear him play in the early days of their marriage, how she would hum along while he provided the melody for their simple evening entertainments. She kept this for a reason. "Oh boy," he said to Sawyer, who had lifted his head at the sound of his master's voice. "Maybe it's time I remembered why." He raised the harmonica to his lips, feeling the cool metal against his skin like a handshake from his younger self. His first attempt produced nothing but a wheeze of air, his technique rusty from disuse, his breath control uncertain. But the second try brought forth a single clear note that seemed to fill the cabin with possibility. Sawyer's reaction was immediate and profound. The dog's ears perked forward, his tail gave a tentative wag, and for the first time in days, his breathing seemed to slow and deepen. Encouraged, Eli tried another note, then another, building slowly toward the melody of Amazing Grace that had always been one of his favorites. The music came haltingly at first, broken by pauses as he remembered fingerings and breath patterns that had once been second nature. But as the familiar tune began to take shape, something loosened in his chest, not the complete release that would come with full healing, but a crack in the wall of silence he had built around his heart. Sawyer settled into his sleeping position for the first time in days, his body relaxing incrementally as each note filled the space between them. The dog's eyes remained fixed on his master, but the anxiety that had marked his expression for so long began to fade, replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. Eli played through the hymn twice, then attempted Danny Boy, the melody emerging with more confidence as muscle memory began to reassert itself. The harmonica's voice was different from his own singing, more plaintive perhaps, but carrying its own form of comfort. It was music stripped to its essence, breath made audible, emotion given form, without the vulnerability of words. When he finally lowered the instrument, the cabin felt different somehow, not filled with the rich warmth that his singing had once provided, but no longer empty either. Sawyer had achieved something approaching true rest, his breathing deep and even. His body finally relaxed after days of tension. "It's not the same as singing," Eli said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "But it's something. It's a start." Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter's approach. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and the tentative return of music, man and dog found a small measure of peace. It was not the complete healing that Martha's letter had called for, but it was movement in the right direction. A first step back toward the light that had been dimmed but not extinguished. The harmonica felt warm in Eli's hands as he wrapped it carefully in its silk covering and placed it on the table beside his chair. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would try again. Tonight, it was enough to have remembered that music, like love, could take many forms, and that sometimes the smallest gesture toward healing could mean the difference between despair and hope. Sarah McKinnon's truck rattled up the mountain road on a Thursday morning, its familiar rumble announcing her approach long before she crested the final rise. Eli watched from the kitchen window as she parked beside his woodpile, her silver hair catching the autumn sunlight as she climbed down from the driver's seat with the careful movements of someone who had learned to respect the mountain's demand for caution. She carried a canvas bag of supplies from town and wore the expression of someone who had been worrying for several days. Sarah had always possessed the teacher's gift for reading between the lines, and Eli suspected his last few encounters with her had revealed more about his state of mind than he had intended. "Morning, Eli," she called as she approached the cabin, but her greeting was directed more towards Sawyer than his master. The dog had emerged from the cabin at the sound of the truck, but moved with none of his usual enthusiasm. His tail wagged half-heartedly, and he remained close to Eli's side instead of bounding forward to greet their visitor as he normally would. "Sarah," Eli nodded, holding the door open for her. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." She studied his face as she passed, taking in the signs of sleepless nights and the weight that seemed to have settled on his shoulders since her last visit. Inside, she set her bag on the kitchen table and immediately went to crouch beside Sawyer, running experienced hands along his neck and flanks. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone that had served her well in 40 years of teaching. "Few days," Eli admitted, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "Started Sunday? Can't seem to settle, won't eat much." Sarah continued her examination of the dog, noting the fine tremor in his hindquarters and the dullness in his normally bright eyes. She had grown up on a ranch before her teaching career, and her hands remembered the signs of distress in animals even after decades in the classroom. "Have you changed anything in his routine?" she asked, accepting the coffee cup Eli offered. "Different food, different schedule, anything that might have unsettled him?" Eli hesitated, unwilling to admit the full truth, but unable to lie outright to someone who had been Martha's friend as much as his own. "Been quieter around here lately," he said finally. Maybe that's got him worried. Sarah's eyes sharpened with understanding. She had known about Eli's morning singing ritual. Martha had mentioned it fondly during their many conversations over the years. The older woman settled into Martha's chair with the familiarity of long friendship and studied Eli over the rim of her coffee cup. "Martha used to tell me about your voice," she said gently. "Said it was the first thing about you that caught her attention, and the thing she missed most when you were away from home." "That was a long time ago," Eli replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Music doesn't have an expiration date." "Eli, it's not like milk that goes bad if you don't use it quick enough." Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Animals are more sensitive to changes in their environment than we give them credit for. Dogs especially. They read our moods, our energy, our habits. If something that's been constant in Sawyer's world suddenly disappears, it's bound to affect him." Eli sat heavily in his reading chair, suddenly feeling every one of his nearly 60 years. "I found a letter from Martha a few days back. Something she wrote before—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. But Sarah's understanding nod told him she had grasped the essential details. "And it threw you off your routine," she said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact." "More than that," Eli admitted. "Made me realize how much I'd been taking for granted. How much I'd missed while she was still here." He gestured toward Sawyer, who had positioned himself between the two humans, as if seeking comfort from their proximity. "Now the poor boy's paying the price for my selfishness." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and watching the interplay between man and dog. Finally, she spoke with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping others navigate difficult transitions. "Grief isn't selfish, Eli. It's necessary. But it becomes dangerous when it cuts us off from the things that keep us connected to life." She set down her cup and reached over to stroke Sawyer's head, the dog leaning into her touch with obvious gratitude. "This old boy isn't just missing your voice. He's missing the part of you that your voice represents, the part that still believes in joy, in comfort, in the simple pleasure of making something beautiful." "I tried playing the harmonica," Eli said, gesturing toward the instrument that still lay wrapped in its silk on the side table. "Seemed to help a little, but it's not the same," Sarah observed, and Eli nodded. "Martha's letter said the singing was medicine, said it healed things that needed healing." He looked down at his hands, weathered from decades of mountain work. "What if I'd forgotten how? What if whatever gift I had died with her?" Sarah stood up and moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the meadow, where the last wildflowers of the season were fading into brown stems. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent her career nurturing potential in others. "The gift doesn't die, Eli. It just goes underground sometimes, like the flowers in winter. But it's still there, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again." She turned back to face him. "Martha knew that, or she wouldn't have written that letter. She was giving you permission to keep singing. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who might need to hear it." Around Sawyer's neck, his leather collar had grown loose in recent days as his appetite had diminished. The collar itself was another gift from Martha, purchased during their last trip to town together. She had chosen the rich brown leather because it complemented his coat, but more importantly because it bore a small brass nameplate engraved with both Sawyer's name and their phone number, a practical gesture that spoke of her hope that he would have many years left to wander the mountain trails safely. Now the collar seemed too large, a visual reminder of how quickly things could change when the fundamental rhythms of life were disrupted. Sarah noticed it too, her expression growing more concerned as she observed the physical toll of Sawyer's distress. "You need to try singing again," she said firmly. Not for Martha, not even for yourself. For him. She knelt beside the dog again, lifting his chin so his tired eyes met hers. Animals don't carry grief the way we do. They live in the present moment, and right now, his present moment is missing something essential. That evening, after Sarah had departed with promises to return in a few days, Eli sat by the fire with his harmonica in one hand and uncertainty weighing heavy on his heart. Sawyer lay beside his chair, closer than usual, his breathing shallow, and his body still carrying that fine tremor of anxiety. "She's right, you know," Eli said quietly. "About the singing. About what you need." But knowing what was needed and finding the courage to provide it remained two different challenges entirely. The harmonica had been a start, but Sarah's words echoed Martha's letter. Some healing required more than instrumental music could provide. It required the vulnerability of the human voice, the courage to let emotion flow freely through song. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the meadow with promise of the long winter ahead. Inside the cabin, man and dog faced the question that would define the months to come, whether love was strong enough to overcome the fear of being heard. The first tentative hum came 3 days after Sarah's visit, while Eli was splitting kindling behind the cabin. The sound surprised him as much as it did Sawyer, a low, almost unconscious vibration that seemed to rise from his chest without permission. He stopped mid-swing, the axe frozen above the half-split log, and looked around as if someone else might have made the sound. Sawyer had been lying in a patch of weak November sunlight. But at the first note, his head lifted with an alertness that had been absent for days. His tail gave a single hopeful wag before settling back to stillness, as if afraid that too much enthusiasm might chase the music away. "Well," Eli said quietly, lowering the axe. That was unexpected. That evening he found himself standing before Martha's bookshelf again, but this time he was searching for something specific. Behind the volumes of poetry and gardening guides, tucked between a worn copy of Little House on the Prairie and a field guide to Montana wildflowers, he found what he was looking for: Martha's recipe book. The leather-bound journal was stained with decades of kitchen use, its pages yellowed and soft from handling. Martha had kept it faithfully throughout their marriage, recording not just ingredients and cooking times, but notes about family visits, seasonal observations, and memories associated with particular dishes. Eli had always teased her about her detailed annotations, but now he understood they were more than cooking instructions. They were the chronicle of a life lived with attention to small joys. As he flipped through the familiar pages, something caught his eye that he had never noticed before. In the margins, beside her recipe for apple butter, Martha had written, in fading blue ink, Eli sang Sweet Caroline while stirring, made the whole kitchen feel like dancing. Next to her instructions for Sunday pot roast, hummed In the Sweet by and by all morning. The meat turned out perfect, but his voice was the real feast. Page after page revealed similar notations, a secret record of how music had woven itself through their daily life together. Beside her famous cornbread recipe, she had noted, Eli's version of Shenandoah. While mixing, neighbors could probably hear him from the road, but who cares? And next to her Christmas cookie instructions, Silent Night in German, the way his grandfather taught him, made me cry every time but happy tears. The discovery hit Eli like a physical blow. All those years, while he had thought his singing was simply a private habit, Martha had been cataloguing each song as if they were precious gifts. She had seen his music not as background noise to their domestic routine, but as an essential ingredient in the recipe of their shared happiness. He carried the book to his reading chair, Sawyer padding along beside him with renewed interest in his master's activities. The dog had been watching Eli more closely since the brief humming episode that afternoon, his brown eyes holding a cautious hope that something familiar might be returning to their disrupted world. "Listen to this." "Boy," Eli said, opening to a page near the middle of the book. "Beef stew for the October church supper." Eli sang old logging songs while chopping vegetables. Mrs. Peterson said she could taste the music in every bite. Note, ask him to sing The Jam on Jerry's Rock next time. It's his best. Sawyer's tail gave another tentative wag at the sound of his master's voice, even when speaking rather than singing. The dog had positioned himself as close as possible to Eli's chair, his grey muzzle resting on the armrest in a gesture that seemed to say, "I'm waiting, and I'll wait as long as it takes." Over the next several days, Eli found himself returning to the recipe book again and again, reading Martha's hidden musical diary with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. She had documented not just what he sang, but how his voice had affected their life together, how Danny Boy could soothe her migraines, how Amazing Grace made their simple meals feel like communion, how his wordless humming while doing chores had created a soundtrack of contentment that she had treasured without ever telling him. The realization that his music had mattered so much to Martha began to chip away at the wall of silence he had built around himself. If his voice had been a gift to her, then perhaps stopping it completely was not honoring her memory, but betraying it. Yet the fear remained, fear that singing would bring back all the emotions he had worked so hard to contain, fear that his voice might crack with disuse, fear that the songs themselves might have lost their power to heal. It was while reading about Martha's Thanksgiving preparations that Eli encountered the entry that changed everything. Written in pencil beside her stuffing recipe, apparently added years after the original ink had dried, were these words: November 1994. Eli lost his voice to bronchitis just before the holiday. No singing for 2 weeks. Even the food seemed to lack flavor without his music to season it. Note, never take the gift of his voice for granted. It's not just entertainment, it's medicine for the soul. The date meant something to Eli. November 1994 had been the year of Martha's first cancer scare, a false alarm that had nonetheless terrified them both with its reminder of mortality. He remembered his illness that month, remembered how frustrated he had been to lose his voice just when Martha needed comfort most. But he had never realized how much his silence had affected her, how deeply she had missed the musical accompaniment to their daily life. She knew, he said aloud, causing Sawyer to lift his head hopefully. Even then, she knew that the music was important. That evening, as the first real snow of winter began to fall in earnest outside the cabin windows, Eli made a decision that had been building for days. He placed Martha's recipe book on the table beside his chair, open to the page about music being medicine for the soul. Then he reached for his harmonica, unwrapping it from its silk covering, with hands that trembled only slightly. But instead of playing an instrumental piece as he had been doing, he took a deep breath and began to hum along with the harmonica's melody, a simple version of Edelweiss that Martha had always loved. His voice was rusty from disuse, cracking slightly on the higher notes, but it was unmistakably singing. Sawyer's response was immediate and profound. The dog's entire body relaxed, as if someone had released a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. His breathing deepened, his tail wagged with something approaching joy, and for the first time in over a week, he settled into the deep, peaceful sleep that had once been his evening routine. The combination of harmonica and voice created a richer sound than either alone, a harmony between breath and melody that filled the cabin with warmth. As Eli played and sang, he could almost hear Martha's voice joining in, could almost see her smile of approval from her reading chair. It was not a complete healing. The grief remained. The loss was still profound, but it was movement in the right direction. Music was returning to the cabin on the mountain, tentatively but surely, like a spring flower pushing through the last snow of winter. The blizzard arrived without warning on a Tuesday night in late November, sweeping down from the crazy mountains with the fury of something that had been held back too long. By morning, the world outside Eli's cabin had transformed into a white wilderness that erased all familiar landmarks and made even the shortest journey treacherous. Snow had drifted against the cabin door to a depth that required serious excavation, and the wind continued to howl around the eaves with a voice that seemed to mock any attempt at human comfort. The power had gone out sometime during the night, leaving Eli dependent on the stone fireplace for heat and oil lamps for light. It was the kind of storm that reminded mountain dwellers why their ancestors had learned to prepare for winter with the seriousness of those who understood that survival was never guaranteed. Trapped inside with only Sawyer for company, Eli found himself facing the enforced intimacy that only a true blizzard could provide. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but tend the fire, ration the food, and wait for the storm to exhaust itself. It was during this period of forced stillness that the wooden flute made its reappearance. He had started carving it 3 summers ago during a particularly long evening when Martha's illness had left her sleeping, and he had needed something to occupy his restless hands. The flute was fashioned from a piece of mountain maple that had fallen during a spring storm, its wood pale and fine-grained, perfect for the delicate work of creating a musical instrument. But like so many projects begun in hope and abandoned in sorrow, the flute had remained unfinished when Martha passed. Eli had put it away in the bedroom closet, unable to continue work on something that had been intended as a surprise for her. Now, with snow piling against the windows and time stretching endlessly before him, he retrieved it from its forgotten corner. The flute was perhaps 2/3 complete. Its body carved and hollowed, its finger holes positioned but not yet refined. The mouthpiece needed work, and the entire instrument required sanding and tuning before it would be capable of producing clear notes. It was, Eli realized, much like himself, functional but unfinished, capable of music but not yet refined enough to sing truly, working by the light of the oil lamp. With Sawyer stretched out before the fire, Eli began the patient process of completing what he had started. The carving knife felt familiar in his hands, its weight and balance remembered from countless evenings of whittling and woodworking. The repetitive motions of shaping and smoothing had always been meditative for him, a way of quieting his mind while his hands created something useful or beautiful. As he worked, he found himself humming, first unconsciously, then with growing deliberation. The tunes seemed to flow from the same source as the movements of his hands, both drawing from some deep well of creativity that grief had temporarily obscured but not destroyed. Sawyer's ears would perk up each time a melody began, and gradually the dog's anxiety gave way to something approaching his old contentment. The storm raged for 3 days, but inside the cabin a different kind of weather was taking hold. Each morning, Eli would build up the fire and continue work on the flute while humming or singing softly. The songs came more easily now, flowing from his throat with less fear and more natural rhythm. He sang old ballads his mother had taught him, hymns from his childhood church, and work songs he had learned from his grandfather's tales of the logging camps. Sawyer's transformation during these days was remarkable. The tremor in his hindquarters disappeared, his appetite returned with enthusiasm, and the bright alertness that had been missing from his eyes gradually reasserted itself. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental was shifting in their shared world, that the music was not just returning, but evolving into something richer than it had been before. On the 2nd day of the storm, as Eli tested the half-finished flute's potential for sound production, he discovered something unexpected. The instrument's voice, even in its incomplete state, blended beautifully with his own singing. The flute could provide melodic lines while he sang harmony, or it could carry the tune while his voice added depth and warmth to the overall sound. It was like discovering that he had been only half of a conversation he was meant to be having with himself. By the 3rd day, when the wind finally began to subside and the snow stopped falling, Eli had completed the flute and achieved something he had not thought possible, a return to musical expression that felt natural and unforced. The songs no longer seemed like painful reminders of what he had lost, but rather like connections to something larger than his individual grief. The flute's voice was sweet and clear, with the warm tone that only hand-carved wood can provide. Its range was limited but expressive, perfect for the simple melodies that had always been Eli's specialty. When he played it alone, it sounded lonely but beautiful, like a bird calling across an empty valley. When he combined it with his singing, it created a richness that neither could achieve independently. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Sawyer as the storm finally exhausted itself and pale sunlight began filtering through the cabin windows. "Think Martha would approve of this partnership?" Sawyer's response was to stretch luxuriously before the fire and settle into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that had been absent from their lives for too many weeks. The dog's contentment seemed to answer Eli's question more eloquently than words could have managed. That evening, as Eli sat by the fireplace with the finished flute in his hands, he realized that the 3 days of enforced isolation had accomplished something that weeks of conscious effort had failed to achieve. The music had returned not through struggle or determination, but through the simple act of creating something beautiful while allowing his natural voice to emerge without judgment or fear. Outside, the world remained buried under feet of snow, but inside the cabin, the silence that had dominated their lives for so many weeks had been replaced by something far more precious, the sound of healing taking root. The flute represented more than just a completed project. It was evidence that he still possessed the ability to create, to bring something new and meaningful into existence, even in the depths of winter and grief. As he prepared for bed that night, Eli found himself humming Silent Night while banking the fire, not because it was Christmas season, though it nearly was, but because the song seemed to capture the peaceful transformation that had settled over their small world. Sawyer dozed contentedly on his rug, his breathing deep and regular, his body finally free of the tension that had marked his demeanor for so many anxious days. The mountain winter stretched ahead of them, long and demanding as always, but no longer empty of music. The flute would help carry them through the dark months, its voice joining with Eli's, to create a soundtrack for their healing that honored both the past they had lost and the future they were learning to embrace. Spring arrived early that year, melting away the last remnants of winter with an urgency that seemed to match the renewed vitality in Eli's mountain cabin. The meadow behind the house had burst into bloom with unusual abundance, wildflowers carpeting the slopes in colors that reminded him of Martha's watercolor paintings. Sawyer had regained not only his health, but seemed to possess an energy that defied his 7 years, bounding through the tall grass with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. It was during one of these perfect May afternoons that Sarah McKinnon's truck appeared again on the mountain road. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dr. Rebecca Hansen from the veterinary clinic in town rode in the passenger seat, her presence suggesting something more serious than a social visit. His eye watched from the porch as the two women approached, noting the careful way Dr. Hansen carried her medical bag and the slight tension in Sarah's usually relaxed demeanor. Sawyer greeted them with his customary enthusiasm, tail wagging and body wiggling with joy, showing no signs of the distress that had marked his behavior during the long weeks of silence mourning. "Ladies," Eli called, setting aside the piece of wood he had been whittling. "Sawyer's doing much better, if that's what you've come to check on." Dr. Hansen, a woman in her 40s with the steady hands and calm demeanor that marked the best of her profession, knelt beside the dog with practiced ease. "Actually, Eli, that's exactly what we need to discuss. Sarah's been telling me about Sawyer's recent health issues, and I think there are some things you should know." As the veterinarian conducted her examination, Eli found himself growing increasingly puzzled. Sawyer submitted to the attention with good grace, his vital signs clearly strong, his coat glossy with health, his eyes bright with intelligence and contentment. Whatever had been wrong with the dog during those dark weeks appeared to have resolved completely. "He looks wonderful now," Dr. Hansen said, completing her initial assessment. "But Sarah's described symptoms that concern me: the tremors, the anxiety, the loss of appetite, the inability to rest. Combined with his age and breed, I wanted to run some tests." "Tests?" Eli asked, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "What kind of tests?" Just routine blood work and a cardiac evaluation. Sarah mentioned that his distress seemed to correlate with changes in your daily routine, particularly involving music. I'd like to understand the connection better. They drove to town that afternoon. Sawyer riding contentedly in the back of Sarah's truck, unaware that he was about to provide answers to questions Eli had never thought to ask. The veterinary clinic occupied a converted house on the edge of town, its examination rooms equipped with the kind of modern diagnostic equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the mountain pioneers who had first settled the valley. The tests themselves were routine: blood samples, x-rays, and an electrocardiogram that required Sawyer to lie still while sensors monitored the electrical activity of his heart. Throughout the process, the dog remained calm and cooperative, as if he understood that these procedures were intended to help rather than harm. It was while they waited for the results that Dr. Hansen asked the question that would reframe everything Eli thought he understood about his relationship with his faithful companion. Tell me about the music, Eli. Sarah says you've been singing to Sawyer since he was a puppy, and that stopping seemed to trigger his recent health problems. It's just something I've always done, Eli replied, unconsciously modest about what had become the central mystery of the past several months. Morning routine, you know. Sweep the floor, hum a few tunes. Sawyer seemed to like it, so I kept doing it. And when you stopped singing, how quickly did his symptoms develop? Within hours, Eli admitted. First day without music, he started pacing. Got worse from there. Dr. Hansen nodded thoughtfully, making notes in Sawyer's medical chart. When the test results arrived an hour later, she studied them with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was seeing something significant. Eli, she said finally, I need to show you something. The electrocardiogram printout looked like abstract art to Eli's untrained eye, a series of peaks and valleys traced in blue ink across a long strip of paper. But Dr. Hansen's finger traced specific patterns with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to read the language of the heart. Sawyer has a condition called atrial fibrillation, she explained. It's not uncommon in older dogs, especially in larger breeds. Essentially, the upper chambers of his heart don't beat in a regular rhythm. Instead of the steady lub-dub pattern you'd expect, his atrial muscles quiver irregularly. Is it serious? Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. It can be if left untreated. The irregular rhythm can lead to poor circulation, fatigue, anxiety, and in severe cases, heart failure. But here's what's fascinating, and this is why I wanted to run these specific tests. There's something in the medical literature about rhythmic auditory stimulation, affecting heart rhythm in both humans and animals. She pulled out another chart, this one showing regular steady waves. This is what a normal heart rhythm looks like. And this, she indicated Sawyer's EKG, shows his irregular pattern. But watch what happens when I compare this to the notes Sarah made about his symptoms. The correlation was undeniable. During the weeks when Eli had sung regularly, Sawyer's episodes of anxiety and restlessness had been minimal. When the music stopped, the symptoms had escalated dramatically. When singing resumed, even tentatively, the dog's condition had begun to improve. Are you saying that my singing was actually treating his heart condition? Eli asked, struggling to comprehend the implications. I'm saying that consistent, rhythmic sound, especially at the frequencies typical of human singing, can help regulate irregular heart rhythms in some animals. It's called entrainment, and while we don't fully understand the mechanism, the effects can be quite pronounced. Dr. Hansen leaned back in her chair, her expression mixing professional fascination with personal amazement. Essentially, your voice has been serving as a natural pacemaker for Sawyer's heart. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Sarah reached over and squeezed Eli's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The man who had thought his music was simply a pleasant habit learned that it had been, quite literally, keeping his best friend alive. The tremors, the anxiety, the inability to rest, Dr. Hansen continued. Those were all symptoms of his heart struggling to maintain adequate circulation. When you sang, the regular rhythm helped his atrial muscles synchronize more effectively. When you stopped, his heart reverted to its irregular pattern, and his body responded with the distress signals you observed. "But he's fine now," Eli said, looking down at Sawyer, who was lying peacefully at his feet, apparently unaware that he had just become the subject of a minor medical miracle. "Because you resumed singing." "But Eli, this condition doesn't go away. Without some form of rhythm regulation, whether through medication, a pacemaker, or," she smiled slightly, "regular musical therapy, the symptoms will return. And as he ages, they'll likely become more severe." The drive back to the mountain was quiet, each of them processing the weight of what they had learned. Sawyer had positioned himself in the truck bed, where he could see Eli through the rear window. His contentment, a stark contrast to the turmoil of emotions his master was experiencing. "She means he could die without the music," Eli said finally, breaking the silence as they climbed the familiar curves toward home. "She means he could die without you," Sarah replied gently. "Your voice isn't just comfort for him, Eli. It's medicine. It's what keeps his heart beating steadily." That evening, as Eli sat by the fireplace with his flute in one hand and the weight of new responsibility settling on his shoulders, he understood that everything had changed. The music he had resumed for emotional healing had revealed itself to be a matter of life and death. Martha's words in her letter, about his voice being medicine that healed things needing healing, had been more literally true than either of them could have imagined. Sawyer lay in his accustomed place by the fire, breathing easily, his heart maintained in its proper rhythm by the simple songs that now carried the weight of survival itself. The gift Eli had thought was meant for human comfort had become the thread that bound his faithful companion to life. The music would continue, not just because it brought joy or honored memory, but because silence in their case was no longer an option. Love had taken the form of song, and song had become the difference between life and death. The knowledge that his voice was literally keeping Sawyer alive transformed every aspect of Eli's daily routine. What had once been casual morning humming became a deliberate medical necessity, each song carefully chosen and consistently delivered. He found himself setting internal alarms, creating a schedule that would ensure Sawyer received regular doses of the rhythmic sound that regulated his heart. But beyond the immediate concern for his companion's health, Dr. Hansen's revelation had awakened something deeper in Eli, a growing awareness that his musical gift might serve purposes larger than he had ever imagined. If his voice could heal Sawyer's irregular heartbeat, what other kinds of healing might it accomplish? It was during this period of intense reflection that Sarah brought news that would challenge Eli to expand his understanding of service beyond the walls of his mountain cabin. "The valley's hurting. Eli," she said during one of her weekly visits in early June. She had taken to coming more regularly since learning about Sawyer's condition, partly to check on the dog's health, but mostly to ensure that Eli understood the weight of his new responsibility. "People are struggling in ways they don't talk about openly." She had brought with her a worn leather songbook from the community church, its pages yellowed with age and softened by decades of handling. The book had belonged to the congregation since its founding in 1887, passed from generation to generation as the community's repository of shared musical memory. "Pastor Williams is retiring at the end of the summer," Sarah continued, settling into Martha's chair with the familiarity of someone who had become essential to the rhythms of the household. 43 years he's served this valley, and there's no replacement coming. The congregation's dwindling, the young people have moved away, and those who remain are carrying burdens that Sunday service alone can't lighten." Eli listened while continuing his evening routine of playing gentle melodies on his flute for Sawyer, who had learned to position himself where he could receive maximum benefit from the musical therapy that kept his heart steady. The dog's contentment had become Eli's primary gauge of whether he was maintaining the proper therapeutic rhythm. "What are you suggesting?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew. The church is planning a harvest gathering for the end of September. It might be the last one if we can't find ways to bring the community together. People are dealing with job losses, medical bills, and family troubles, all the things that make folks feel isolated, even when they're surrounded by neighbors. Sarah opened the songbook, revealing pages marked with decades of pencil annotations and marginal notes. They need what you can give them, Eli. They need to remember that there's still beauty in the world, still reasons to hope. The songbook itself told the story of the valley's musical heritage. Its pages contained hymns brought by German settlers, folk songs carried west by families seeking new lives, and spirituals that had provided comfort through generations of hardship. The margins bore witness to births, deaths, weddings, and farewells, a chronicle of a community that had used music to mark every significant moment of their shared existence. "I don't perform for people anymore," Eli said. But his protest lacked conviction. "Haven't in years." "I wouldn't know how to begin." "It's not about performing," Sarah replied gently. "It's about sharing." These people knew Martha, remember her kindness. They know about your loss, and they respect your privacy. But they also remember hearing your voice carry across the valley during the summer evenings when you and Martha would sit on your porch. They remember how your singing could make a simple church service feel like something sacred. Over the following days, Sarah's words settled into Eli's consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground. He found himself studying the community songbook, recognizing melodies from his childhood, remembering how his mother had sung some of these same songs while hanging laundry or preparing meals. The music connected him not just to his own past, but to the broader history of people who had faced hardship and found strength in shared song. But the decision to perform publicly again carried risks that went beyond simple stage fright. His morning routine with Sawyer had become precisely calibrated to the dog's medical needs, specific songs at regular intervals, maintaining consistent rhythm and frequency to support his companion's cardiac health. How could he expand that gift to serve others without compromising the life-sustaining care that Sawyer required? Dr. Hansen, when consulted, provided both reassurance and practical guidance. "The beautiful thing about music therapy," she explained during a follow-up visit to check Sawyer's condition, "is that it doesn't diminish with sharing. If anything, performing for others might enhance the beneficial effects for Sawyer. The emotional satisfaction of using his gift in service to his community could reduce Eli's stress levels, which would in turn create a more positive environment for the dog's healing. She recommended that Eli bring Sawyer to any public performance, noting that the dog's presence would serve both as a comfort to his master and as a living reminder of why the music mattered. "Animals have a way of keeping us grounded in the present moment," she observed. "Sawyer's contentment during your performances will be your best indicator that you're maintaining the right therapeutic qualities in your voice." The summer weeks that followed were filled with preparation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Eli expanded his daily musical routine, adding afternoon sessions that combined his flute with extended vocal exercises. He worked through the songs in the community songbook, testing which melodies felt most natural to his voice and most beneficial to Sawyer's condition. The dog had become an eager participant in these practice sessions, his behavior serving as a barometer of musical effectiveness. Songs that maintained steady, moderate tempos clearly had the most positive effect on his demeanor, while faster or more complex pieces seemed to create mild anxiety. Eli learned to read these subtle signals, gradually developing a repertoire that balanced artistic satisfaction with medical necessity. As word spread through the valley that Eli might be willing to share his music at the harvest gathering, visitors began appearing at his cabin with increasing frequency. Old neighbors brought casseroles and news, church members stopped by with tentative invitations and gentle encouragement. Each visitor carried stories of personal struggles, lost jobs, failed crops, family illnesses, the 100 small tragedies that can accumulate like stones in the heart, but they also brought memories of better times, stories of how music had helped the community weather previous difficulties. They remembered barn raisings that had been made bearable by work songs, funeral services that had been transformed by hymns of comfort, wedding celebrations that had been elevated by melodies of joy. The music had always been there, they reminded him, woven into the fabric of their shared existence, like a thread that connected past to present. Martha's presence seemed especially strong during these summer evenings of preparation. Her recipe book remained open on the side table, her musical annotations serving as both inspiration and guidance. Eli could imagine her delight at seeing their cabin filled with visitors again, could picture her smile of approval as he worked to expand his gift beyond their private domestic sphere. The harvest gathering was scheduled for the last Saturday in September, timed to coincide with the peak of autumn colors and the completion of the season's final crops. The church committee had planned the event as both celebration and farewell, a chance to honor Pastor Williams's long service while acknowledging that the future of their small congregation remained uncertain. As the date approached, Eli found himself experiencing a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The stakes felt enormous, not just for his own return to public performance, but for Sawyer's ongoing health and for a community that needed to remember its capacity for joy. The music would have to serve multiple purposes, keeping his companion's heart beating steadily, honoring Martha's memory, and providing comfort to neighbors who were struggling with their own forms of loss. But perhaps most challenging of all, Eli would have to find the courage to be vulnerable in front of others again, to let his voice carry emotions that had been private for so long, to trust that the gift Martha had recognized and Dr. Hansen had validated could indeed serve as medicine for more than one wounded heart. The community songbook lay open on his reading table, its pages marked with the selections he had chosen for the gathering. Beside it, his great-grandfather's fiddle waited in its case, retrieved from storage after decades of silence. Tomorrow, he would begin the final preparations for a performance that would test whether love, expressed through music, could indeed heal not just one faithful dog, but an entire community that had forgotten how to sing together. Sawyer dozed peacefully by the fireplace, his steady breathing a reminder that some forms of healing could not be postponed or avoided. The music would continue, as it always had, but now it would reach beyond the walls of their cabin to touch lives that needed the medicine only a human voice could provide. The morning of the harvest gathering dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to glow from within. Eli had risen before dawn, not from anxiety, but from the familiar rhythm of mountain mornings that had structured his life for 30 years. As he performed his usual routine, kindling the fire, starting the coffee, taking up his father's broom, his voice carried the steady cadence of "Morning has." Broken, its melody drifting through the cabin like a gentle blessing. Sawyer had positioned himself in his accustomed spot by the fireplace, but his attention remained focused on his master with an intensity that suggested the dog understood this day would be different from their usual quiet routine. The faithful hound's breathing was steady and deep, his heart maintained in its proper rhythm by the therapeutic music that had become as essential to his survival as food and water. In the bedroom closet, wrapped carefully in the wool blanket that had belonged to his great-grandfather, lay the fiddle that would complete Eli's musical arsenal for the day's performance. He had retrieved it 3 days earlier, spending long hours reacquainting himself with its voice and testing its harmony with both his singing and Sawyer's medical needs. The instrument was a work of art in its own right, crafted in 1892 by a German immigrant who had settled in the Bitterroot Valley and built instruments that sang with the clarity of mountain streams. The fiddle's case bore the scratches and wear of decades of use, but the instrument itself had been maintained with religious devotion by 3 generations of Boone men. Its maple back gleamed with the patina that only age and loving care could provide, while its spruce top bore the subtle wear patterns left by countless hours of playing. Most importantly for this day's purposes, its voice blended perfectly with Eli's singing, creating harmonies that seemed to settle Sawyer into states of profound peace. As the morning progressed, visitors began arriving to help transport equipment and provide moral support for Eli's return to public performance. Sarah came first, her truck loaded with folding chairs and her expression mixing excitement with protective concern for her friend's well-being. Dr. Hansen arrived shortly after, ostensibly to check on Sawyer's condition, but clearly also curious to observe the therapeutic effects of extended musical performance on both dog and master. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Hansen asked, kneeling beside Sawyer to conduct a quick assessment of his vital signs. The dog submitted to the examination with good grace, his tail wagging gently and his breathing remaining steady and regular. "Nervous," Eli admitted, securing the fiddle case in the back of Sarah's truck. "It's been a long time since I've played for anyone other than Sawyer in the mountains." "Remember that you're not performing for entertainment," Sarah said gently. "You're sharing something that people need. There's a difference." The drive to the church took them down mountain roads that Eli had traveled countless times, but today the familiar landscape seemed charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. Sawyer rode in the truck bed, his grey muzzle lifted to catch the autumn wind, apparently untroubled by the departure from routine that had his master's hands trembling slightly on the fiddle case. The old stone church sat in a meadow at the heart of the valley, its simple architecture designed more for acoustic beauty than visual grandeur. Built in 1889 by the same community that had created the songbook Eli carried, the building had witnessed generations of celebrations, sorrows, and the quiet moments of faith that sustained mountain people through long winters and uncertain times. Cars and trucks were already gathering in the gravel parking area, their occupants unloading covered dishes and folding tables for the communal meal that would follow the musical portion of the gathering. Eli recognized most of the faces, neighbors he had known for decades, church members who had supported Martha during her illness, young families who were struggling to build lives in an economy that offered few opportunities for those who chose to remain in rural communities. As he carried his fiddle case toward the church steps, Eli was struck by how many people had come, despite the uncertain weather and the competing demands of harvest season. The community had turned out not just for entertainment, but for something deeper, a shared recognition that they needed what he had to offer, needed to remember their capacity for collective joy and mutual support. Inside the church, afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across wooden pews that had been polished smooth by decades of use. The acoustic properties that had made this building legendary among regional musicians were immediately apparent. Every footstep, every whispered conversation carried with crystal clarity, promising that his voice and fiddle would reach every corner without strain. A small area had been prepared near the altar, with a simple wooden chair for Eli and a cushioned bed for Sawyer, positioned where the dog could remain close to his master throughout the performance. The faithful hound settled onto his designated spot with the calm confidence of an animal who trusted completely in his human's judgment, his presence serving as both comfort and reminder of why this music mattered. As people filed into the pews and the familiar sounds of community gathering filled the sacred space, Eli opened his great-grandfather's fiddle case and began the final, preparations for a performance that would test whether 3 generations of musical tradition could indeed serve as medicine for hearts that had forgotten how to hope. The first notes emerged from the fiddle like water finding its course, tentative at first, then gathering strength and clarity as Eli's muscle memory reconnected with an instrument that had waited decades for his return. He had chosen Amazing Grace for the opening, a melody so deeply embedded in the valley's musical DNA that even the youngest children could hum along. The fiddle sang the main theme while his voice provided harmony, creating layers of sound that seemed to rise naturally from the stone walls themselves. Sawyer's response was immediate and profound. The dog's body relaxed completely into his cushioned bed, his breathing deepening to the steady rhythm that indicated his heart was finding perfect synchronization with the music. Dr. Hanson, seated in the front pew, where she could observe both performer and patient, made discreet notes about the visible signs of therapeutic success that were manifesting in real time, but it was the congregation's reaction that transformed the moment from medical treatment to something approaching the sacred. As Eli's voice gained strength and confidence, joined by the sweet cry of the fiddle, people throughout the church began to weep, not from sorrow, but from the sudden recognition of beauty they had forgotten they were capable of experiencing. The music seemed to unlock emotions that had been carefully contained, allowing grief, hope, and joy to flow together in ways that felt both cathartic and healing. Around Eli's neck, suspended on a simple silver chain, hung Martha's wedding ring, a gesture he had made that morning without conscious thought, but which now felt like the completion of a conversation that had been interrupted by death. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows, creating small rainbows that danced across the fiddle's polished surface as he played. "Before he cheers the village with song," Eli sang, his voice rising with increasing confidence. "A man must learn the music living in his own heart." The words weren't part of the traditional hymn, but seemed to flow from some deeper source of wisdom that the performance was accessing. Around him, the congregation leaned forward, hungry for every note, every word that might provide comfort for struggles they had carried alone for too long. As the first song concluded, Eli transitioned seamlessly into "The Water is Wide," a ballad his mother had sung during the hardest years of his childhood when his father was away working the timber camps. The fiddle provided a haunting counterpoint to his voice, weaving melodic lines that seemed to capture the longing and resilience of people who had chosen to make their lives in difficult places. From the middle pews, an elderly woman's voice joined his. Mrs. Henderson, who had lost her husband the previous winter and had not been seen at social gatherings since the funeral. Her voice was fragile but true, carrying harmony that strengthened Eli's melody and encouraged others to add their own voices to the growing chorus. Soon the church was filled not with performance, but with participation, a community rediscovering its capacity for shared expression. The transformation in the room was palpable. Faces that had carried the weight of private sorrows began to soften. Shoulders that had been hunched with individual burdens began to straighten. Children who had been fidgeting in their pews grew still and attentive, as if recognizing instinctively that they were witnessing something significant. Even teenagers who had arrived, with the reluctant compliance of youth, found themselves drawn into the musical conversation that was developing. Organically throughout the sanctuary, Eli moved through his carefully prepared repertoire, but found himself also responding to the needs he sensed in specific faces throughout the congregation. When he saw young Billy Morrison, whose family farm was facing foreclosure, he shifted into "This land is your land," with a gentle intensity that spoke of belonging and permanence. When his eyes met those of Sarah Martinez, whose teenage son was struggling with addiction, he offered "Lead Me Gently Home." With a tenderness that acknowledged both hope and fear, the fiddle seemed to possess its own intelligence, suggesting melodic variations and harmonic possibilities that Eli's conscious mind might not have considered. 3 generations of Boone men had poured their musical souls into this instrument, and now their combined wisdom was flowing through his hands and voice to touch hearts that had grown accustomed to carrying their burdens in isolation. But perhaps most remarkably, Sawyer had become an active participant in the healing that was taking place. The dog's presence seemed to anchor the entire experience in something authentic and immediate. When children grew restless, their eyes would find the grey-muzzled hound sleeping peacefully beside his master, and they would settle back into attention. When adults felt overwhelmed by emotion, Sawyer's visible contentment reminded them that some forms of peace were achievable, even in the midst of difficulty. As the sun began to slant lower through the western windows, painting the church interior in shades of gold and amber, Eli realized that Martha's wedding ring around his neck was not the weight of loss he had expected it to be, but rather a connection to love that continued to create beauty in the world. Her presence felt strongest, not as memory, but as ongoing participation in the healing that was flowing through his voice and touching every heart in the room. The music continued, building toward revelations that would reshape not just Eli's understanding of his gift, but the entire community's sense of what was possible when people chose to share their deepest truths with one another. The harvest moon rose full and bright 3 months after the church gathering, casting silver light across the meadow where Eli had scattered Martha's cremated remains 5 years earlier. But tonight, the silence that had once marked this sacred space was filled with a different kind of presence. The gentle chiming of wind chimes he had crafted from Martha's jewelry, their voices carrying melodies across the mountain air even when his own voice was still. The chimes hung from the oak tree that shaded Martha's favorite reading spot, each piece carefully shaped and tuned to create harmonies that honored her memory while contributing to the ongoing soundtrack of their mountain home. Her silver bracelet provided the highest notes, clear and bright as morning birdsong. Her copper earrings added warmth in the middle register, while her grandmother's brass locket supplied the deep, resonant tones that grounded the entire composition. The wind chimes represented the completion of a journey that had begun with silence and led to understanding. That love could take many forms, including music that continued even when the musician was at rest. Inside the cabin, Sawyer slept the deep sleep of perfect health beside the fireplace, his breathing steady and strong, his heart beating in the regular rhythm that Eli's daily songs had taught it to maintain. The old hound was approaching his 8th birthday now, but his eyes remained bright with intelligence and his step retained the spring of a dog who knew himself to be deeply loved and carefully tended. Dr. Hansen's most recent examination had revealed not just stable cardiac function, but marked improvement in overall vitality that she attributed to the consistent musical therapy he received. The cabin itself had been transformed by the integration of music back into daily life, but it was music enriched by purpose and community rather than diminished by isolation. The kitchen table now held sheet music for the monthly gatherings at the church, where Eli had become the volunteer music director for a congregation that had rediscovered its voice. The front room housed both his great-grandfather's fiddle and the wooden flute he had completed during the winter storm, instruments that served therapeutic purposes as much as artistic ones. But perhaps the most significant change was the addition of a guest room that had been created from Martha's former sewing space. Word of the healing that had taken place at the harvest gathering had spread beyond the valley, bringing visitors who sought the kind of comfort that only authentic human connection could provide. Some came for musical instruction, others for the simple peace that seemed to inhabit the mountain cabin. All left with the understanding that healing was possible, even after the deepest losses. Sarah McKinnon had become a regular fixture in their routine. Her weekly visits, now including planning sessions for the community events that had begun to flourish since the September gathering. The church congregation had grown by 1/3, drawing not only long-time residents, but newcomers who were attracted by the promise of a place where music and faith combined to create genuine sanctuary. She had taken to bringing her own guitar to accompany Eli during the evening practice sessions, their voices blending in harmonies that would have made Martha smile with recognition. The seasonal rhythms that had always structured mountain life now included musical markers that connected the community across the distances that geography imposed. Spring brought Easter services where Eli's voice lifted "Christ the Lord is risen today" to heights that made the stone church seem to expand beyond its physical boundaries. Summer evenings featured porch concerts where neighbors gathered to share songs and stories while their children played in the meadow grass. Autumn meant harvest celebrations that had become regional gatherings, drawing people from surrounding valleys who had heard about the man whose voice could heal both hearts and cardiac arrhythmias. Winter remained the most challenging season, but it was no longer marked by the profound isolation that had characterized the years immediately following Martha's death. The musical routines that sustained Sawyer's health had expanded to include recordings that Eli made for community members who were housebound by age or illness. These simple cassette tapes, featuring familiar hymns and folk songs, provided not just entertainment, but a form of medical intervention that Dr. Hansen had begun prescribing for patients with anxiety, depression, and various stress-related conditions. The morning ritual that had started everything continued unchanged in its essential elements. Eli still rose with the first light, kindled the fire, started the coffee, and took up his father's hand-carved broom. But now his songs carried the weight of deeper understanding about their purpose and power. As he swept the cabin floor and filled the space with melody, he was no longer simply maintaining a habit or processing grief. He was performing a medical intervention that kept his beloved companion alive while honoring the memory of a woman whose love had been wise enough to recognize the healing potential in his voice. The letters from Martha had been joined by others, cards from community members expressing gratitude, notes from Dr. Hansen documenting Sawyer's continued health improvements, and correspondence from researchers who had learned about the case and wanted to study the relationship between musical therapy and cardiac function in animals. But none of these communications carried the emotional weight of Martha's words, which remained his primary source of guidance and encouragement. As autumn deepened toward winter and the anniversary of discovering Martha's letter approached, Eli found himself reflecting on the journey that had led from silence to song, from isolation to community, from the brink of losing Sawyer to the recognition that their bond represented something larger than individual friendship. The music had become a bridge connecting past to present, grief to healing, individual need to community service. On this particular evening, as the wind chimes sang their gentle song and Sawyer dreamed his peaceful dreams, Eli sat in his reading chair with the harmonica that had started his journey back to music. But instead of playing, he simply held the instrument and listened to the sounds that surrounded him. The whisper of wind through pine branches, the distant call of an owl, the barely audible melody of Martha's jewelry transformed into music that would continue long after human voices had fallen silent. Sometimes the deepest love comes without words, he reflected, remembering the opening lines of the story that had brought them to this place of healing. But sometimes love finds its truest expression in the songs we share, when we finally understand that someone is always listening. Someone always needs the medicine that only a human heart can provide through the simple gift of making music in a world that has forgotten how to sing.